Hi there, I'm Caitlin Bandy, and this is Jamie with Jamie Kate, and we're here to do our discussion today of When We Were Orphans by Kazuo Ishiguro for the Backlist Book Club. You can see we have some different copies here. I think mine is the original copy, and Jamie, you said you think you have a UK version?
Yeah, this is the Faber Books. I bought this in, Oxford. I bought this in Oxford, England.
How very fancy.
Yeah.
I'm not sure where I got this. I might have gotten this from a library sale like quite a long time ago. But yeah, this is the Alfred Knopf New York version. So,
Nice.
but mine has some nice deckled edges on it.
Oh, yeah. I mean, are you a fan of deckled edges? Those are kind of controversial.
It depends on the book. It does make up for this like not so nice cover though.
I know. I feel like Ishiguro unfortunately does have some not great covers.
Yeah, I would say his like most recent book, Clara and the Sun, like the cover was a little bit better, but yeah, some of his older ones are a little dated, I guess.
Yeah.
Maybe they were edgy for the time. I don't know.
Right.
So, what did you think of this book this time?
Oh my God. I'm upset because I did not like this.
Okay.
And I'm upset because I had such high hopes. This book has been on my shelf for so long. And the reason that I like pitched it for our book club was because it has been sitting there, and it was kind of one of those books where it's like it was like one of those books that I thought was going to end up being my favorite. So I kind of like for some reason just like wouldn't touch it. Does that ever happen to you?
Yeah.
You like have such high expectations. And I think that, and so I was like, oh, I'll pitch it for this book. We can, read it, talk to each other, it'll be great. That was not the reality that I had with this book. And I will get into why in a bit, but
we've had a streak of tough reads, huh?
Yeah, we have.
I will say that I liked this better than the last two books, at least.
Ooh, okay.
I won't say that this is my favorite for sure. I have read 4 books by Ishiguro now, and I think this is out of the 4, I would put this at like the 3 spot for his books.
I'm curious.
Yeah, so I really liked Never Let Me Go. That's probably my favorite, and I feel like that's like the gold standard for his writing. And I really liked Clara and the Sun, and then I would put When We Were Orphans in that 3rd spot, and then I would put Remains of the Day in the 4th spot.
Okay.
The thing is, with The Remains of the Day, I read it a long time ago, and I read it when I wasn't really as much of a reader. And I think that if I read it now, maybe my perspective would change on it. So it's something that I'm kind of interested in rereading down the road and seeing if I still assess it the same way. But as I recall it, like 4 or 5 years ago, whenever I read it, I didn't recall really enjoying it. I thought it was kind of boring and dull and very reflective. And I wasn't really into that type of writing back then so much. So yeah,
okay.
I don't know. This one was kind of for me. It wasn't a hate it, wasn't a love it. Just, it was there,
Yeah, definitely. I think like before we get into actually like talking about the book itself, I like want to, talk about Ishiguro as an author. And the reason that I was like so drawn to this book is because I mean, I've read multiple Ishiguro at this point. Never Let Me Go is one of my favorite books of all time. Like not only like I assumed that because I love that book so much that Ishiguro was going to be forever a favorite author of mine.
Right.
But unfortunately, the 2 others that I've read from him, I have read Clara and the Sun, and then now having read When We Were Orphans, the track record is not strong, which is very upsetting because I'm like, Never Let Me Go is so good. But then I remember that the first time I read Never Let Me Go was actually in college. And listen, I was a freshman. I was a dumb freshman in college. So I didn't even, so like, come on, I did not know what I was saying. But I remember not enjoying it the first time I read it. And I really did not get it. I didn't get like the pace was really weird. And like, it was fun that it has those sci-fi elements, but like, it's slow, right? Like, it's like very, I mean, it's soft in a way, which I think is, clearly what he loves to do. And I didn't get it. But then when I read it again last year, I was like, this is like one of the greatest pieces of literature I've ever read. I loved it. Clara and the Sun, I had a rough time with. I was, especially in the second half, Clara and the Sun really lost me. I wouldn't say it's like horrible, but I was like very lost in the second half. And then I still really want to read Remains of the Day though. I think like a lot of people really like that one as well. So, but now I'm nervous. Now I'm nervous. So we'll see.
Yeah, like I said, my perspective is like to be taken with a grain of salt here because like I read it a long time ago before I really got into a lot of literary fiction. I just remember it being kind of like stodgy
Mhm.
and slow and just, you
Yeah.
know, not exactly what I was hoping.
Mhm.
Um, but again, now that I've read a lot more literary fiction and like a lot more reflective books, and I'm like learning to appreciate books that are more observational
Mhm.
than action based, I may appreciate it more than I did.
Yeah.
Um, yeah. So, Never Let Me Go. I think we both agree that's, you know, the highlight of his work. And I think one of the things that we kind of identified when we were talking about this earlier is that he has this kind of signature style where
Mhm.
he's kind of a like quiet or soft writer where he's like got this serene sort of floating writing that goes along smoothly, but you can kind of feel that undercurrent of something wrong or something
Yeah.
off like underneath that
Yeah.
pleasant feeling. I think the thing that I wonder is like if you've read Never Let Me Go as the first book, that's like a
Mhm.
master class in how to do that, how to write that
Mhm.
beautiful, serene, idyllic, almost utopian feeling situation and then flip it on somebody, right? And
Mhm.
since you know that he does that well, it's like after that, when you read any of his other works, you're
Right.
almost looking for that. So I
Yeah.
wonder if that affects the quality of the reads. I don't know, you know,
Yeah. I mean, I don't know. I think part of that, I think what you're saying is completely right. And I think it did affect my feelings on When We Were Orphans, actually, which When We Were Orphans came out. I mean, I don't know when I don't know what year it came out, but it came out before Never Let Me Go. It
um,
did. It did. I just don't know how many years. Oh, 2000. Okay. And Never Let Me Go. I have it right here. I have it. I can tell you right now.
here I'm trying to Google and you've got the books just handy.
I also have the Buried Giant, which I have not read, but
I
that's the
haven't
only
read
one. I
that
need
yet
to
either.
get Remains of the Day, but 2005. Okay, so When We Were Orphans came out 5 years before, and I do think it did affect because like I was, now if we're gonna get into a little bit of the plot stuff, I was expecting that I was expecting this like big thing at the end,
Mhm.
and I just like feel like I don't know. I feel like I knew where this book was going, like at about the halfway mark. And so I was like, well, what is the second half? What's going on here?
I agree. I think that the twist or the like shocking reveal wasn't super surprising,
Hmm.
but I also wonder like if we had read this in 2000, would we still have that same opinion? I think
That's
that
true.
this like what do I want to say? This like literary fiction with almost like a thriller twist to it
Mhm.
has become a lot more popular. You know, I think of like books like I'm thinking of Ending Things, where you know it's you have this whole narrative that goes along and then all of a sudden it flips at the end. Um,
Right.
and I feel like that's become a really popular style of writing or presenting stories. So I wonder if you know we're perhaps like slightly jaded to that, and that's why it made
Right.
it feel a little more predictable.
Yeah, exactly. Like you can't just write a story anymore. You have to have like a big twist, a big reveal at the end, something that like recontextualizes everything, which look, that's my favorite kind of stuff, right? I love to get to the end and realize that, everything I've thought up until this point, was
Different.
wrong or different or something, that's really fun. But it's like, is that reasonable? Is that reasonable to expect that we can do that every time? Maybe
Not
not.
all the time, yeah. So I wonder because like I feel like this does have a like not a twist necessarily, but it does
Mhm.
have a reveal. And I wonder if like my current reading affects the way that I perceive this because let's face it, this book is 25 years old now. Uh,
Yeah,
sounds weird to say. So I
I
mean,
know, right? Talk about a
quarter,
backlist book.
really, it's a quarter of a century old. And so I feel like this might have been a little edgier at the time that it was written than it would be for somebody reading it right now.
Yeah, definitely. And I think like when you say it like that, I mean, like I hadn't thought about how not recent this book is because I just feel like
Right?
yeah, Ishiguro, he just like feels like he's, constantly relevant. Like he's constantly in the conversation of contemporary literary, stars. Like
Sure.
he's always in there. But it's like, yeah, I mean, his best works. I mean, he did write Clara the Sun, and I think it got, mixed. I think across the board.
Right.
But like his best works, and I think people would say that Never Let Me Go is, a lot of people say that's his best work. Same thing with Remains of the Day. those books were both written. Yeah, they're older now, so it's like
Right.
it's hard to contextualize what people would have, been experiencing at that time with what we're experiencing now, which like all of our media is getting faster, it's getting simpler. It's like it's hard. It's hard to read a book like when we were orphans. Like, what I was thinking when I actually read this is that like I picked it up and I was like, oh, this is like, 300 pages. Like I'll be able to read this in like, 3 or 4 days.
Mhm.
And it took me so long to read this book. Like it felt like it was a 500-page novel because the style is different. It's different than what we typically read now.
Yeah.
So it's hard to like contextualize what this would have felt like in the time it was written.
Yeah, yeah. No, and I mean that's sometimes like why I struggle with classics even is just because you're reading something that like, yeah, in 1873 this was super edgy and relevant, but like right now reading it, you're like, this feels so antiquated and dry.
Yeah.
And so I'm trying to get better about like when I read something that's from, a different time period. Gosh, it feels weird saying something from 2000 is a different time period. But when I read something that's from a past time period, I try to like think about, okay, if I can remember that time period, then like what was the trend at that time? And I just feel like this was probably, pretty cutting edge at the time.
Yeah, for sure. It also doesn't help that the way, like the voice in which he's using the character, the protagonist, the time period that this book is set in, it does to me read like a classic. And it has the structure of a lot of classics where you have a protagonist you're not in the moment with them. Well, it does happen in the second half of the book, but for the first part is really long. And it's like him looking back in time. And that's the structure of a lot of classics. They're not often active. They're characters thinking about things that happened before and recalling different pieces and pulling characters from other points of their life rather than like people that they're immediately interacting with. I think that's like it's very interesting that he chose to do that structure. I do think it was intentional. And it makes it feel like reading a classic.
I agree. This is probably why I would rank it like a little lower on the scale is just because it's kind of, that old timey feel to the book.
Yeah.
I will say that I liked the second half of the book better than the first half.
Mm-hmm.
The first half, it was like plodding along and I just was like, is this anything ever going to happen here?
Yeah.
At least in the second half, there was like some action and some excitement. Even though I felt like you did, the conclusion was relatively predictable. I kind of saw where some things were going.
Yeah.
Especially like the big reveal around his parents. I just was like, eh.
Yeah, you're like, well, we saw that. I mean, it was weird because I'm like, is this even like, I'm like, was it a reveal? Like, I think he straight up like said it. Like, I thought it was like text, like, I didn't think it was really meant to be a surprise, but that's kind of the same thing happened in Never Let Me Go as well. Because if on a reread, well, I guess you have more information on a reread, but it's like, I feel like at times like they just say what's going on, but you still don't feel like you actually know what's going on until the end of the book. So just another little Ishiguro thing that he's kind of very good at doing.
I think the thing with Never Let Me Go is that like you could allude to the fact that I don't want to spoil, but spoilers if you haven't read Never Let Me Go. He's like alluding to this system where they're harvesting organs from children, and like we don't have stuff like that occurring. So I think you could easily read over those allusions or those hints because you're not expecting it to happen necessarily. It's not like something that you walk around thinking about on a daily basis. Like, oh, what if we harvested organs from, human beings or whatever? Whereas I feel like the scenario that's presented in When We Were Orphans, I think that actually happens.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe not like word for word what happened in this particular book, but like women do get exploited and trafficked and things like that. People get murdered. People are victims of, all sorts of horrific violence. And so the reveal, when you get to it, like it's not a scenario that you couldn't possibly imagine, if that makes sense. And I think that's why maybe Never Let Me Go is a little more successful, is because it's relying on to you to not be able to imagine this horrific scenario versus versus When We Were Orphans leaning into the everyday,
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. And I think, I don't know. I think something about the way it's written and I think maybe it's the protagonist, maybe it's the perspective as well. But one thing I love about Never Let Me Go and how it compares, you know, I do think there's a lot of comparisons to be made from to When We Were Orphans as well, because they both have a big theme of memory, but specifically they have a character that is just reflecting on times in the past. And but When We Were Orphans, really, like, especially in the first half, it's like memories inside memories inside memories. It's like
Mhm.
Inception memory. Um, but I think what it made me think of is how in Never Let Me Go, you're getting this perspective of an older person
Mhm.
reflecting on a time in their childhood when this thing is happening that, you know, they can't possibly, you know, they don't have the understanding. Children don't have the awareness to understand what's going on, and that's like what makes that book so tragic. It's because, like, they're kids and
Right.
they can't understand what's happening to them, and they have no reference. They are not allowed into the other parts of the world, so they
Right.
have nothing to compare it to. Whereas,
Right.
like, in When We Were Orphans, he is reflecting on a time that happened in his childhood, but it's almost like I don't know. I think it's just the reason I didn't love this one as much is because it's not like we were introduced to the which I'm realizing that we didn't even talk about what When We Were Orphans is about, but we did not get introduced to the the warlord until the moment that like
The
the
reveal.
adult character kind of makes that connection, you know? Where
Mhm.
it's like I wish that we would have seen that character through the kid's eyes
Mhm.
because it's like, well, he doesn't even have that interaction. He
Right.
doesn't interact with him hardly at all. So it's like, then I think that's what messed me up, okay? Because the book says, the back of the book, and then what I think I was promised, it says, um, um, oh wait, okay, maybe this one doesn't say it, but basically, like the thing I was reading was basically saying that like the book was about him having to recontextualize something in his childhood or like not understanding something about his childhood, and that's what I was kind of hoping to get at,
Mhm.
but like we don't even get any of the moments that need to be recontextualized until like the exact time that they are. So I don't think we as the reader even have the chance to like think about, you know, we don't have the sense of like, oh, that's weird. What's going on here? Because we're
Mhm.
immediately basically told exactly what's going on. Does that make sense? I'm rambling.
It's okay. I think too, like with when because we're comparing a lot between Never Let Me Go and When We Were Orphans. The thing
Mhm,
with like Never Let Me Go is it leans into that naivete that the kids are,
mhm.
they're young, they're not experienced, they're very sheltered. And we recognize that they're like maybe naive, maybe sheltered, but you don't necessarily expect them to be taken advantage of in the way
Yeah.
that it's coming. Whereas in When We Were Orphans, it feels like the character is being purposefully naive and purposefully
Mhm.
obtuse.
Yeah,
There's
yeah.
all these reasons throughout the story for him to grow up, for him to mature, for him to have a better understanding of the world, for him to reflect on the situation that is unfolding and like kind of see what's going on. And instead, he like lets his obsession take over and he
Mhm.
kind of stays in this like boyhood mentality throughout the story. And I kind of found that grating. Like as he was an adult,
Mhm.
you're like, come on, dude, like you're not 10 anymore. I understand when you're 10 and your parents disappeared and you need to like find a logical reason for why they disappeared and what happened to them. And you make up these stories and,
Mhm.
give yourself this happy ending. But like, as an adult man who works as a detective and sees probably the worst of society, to think that he couldn't put the puzzle pieces together of like what happened and then this like fantasy that he's going to
Mhm.
rescue his parents from, they're being held hostage in this location and he's going to rescue them and like he endangers all of these people. And
Yeah.
then I found him kind of insufferable, honestly, like, again, I know we haven't really even gone into summarizing this book yet, which we should probably do after my spiel
Yeah.
here.
Go ahead.
um he goes into the settlements during that Sino-Japanese conflict, and he's like literally asking people to risk their lives so that he can get to this building to find this fantasy that he's created in his head. And
Yeah.
he's so oblivious to the fact that there's a war occurring around him and that people have way bigger concerns than his missing parents. And it was frustrating. And because of
Yeah.
that, I found it hard to empathize with him. Whereas like the kids, as they're growing up in Never Let Me Go, you empathize with them because you've been that naive person and then you've had your reality shattered. Uh,
Mhm.
and I think that's the thing here is that in When We Were Orphans, his reality isn't shattered. He's continued to create his own reality that shuts out everything around him.
Yeah. No, I mean, absolutely. I think like, and then going off of what you're saying, the other thing is like, he's just, you really get this sense of like, he feels like he's the only victim in
Right.
this situation, which is just, categorically false. Like, not only, so many people have been victims to everything that was going on in this book, not only the war, but also the intentional opioid crisis that was going on at the
Yeah.
time. And, there was just so many more victims. And yes, what happened to him was unfortunate, but like, not, I mean, like, just a fraction of suffering compared to a lot of other people
Right.
that are kind of just ignored in this book entirely, which again, I think is totally the point. Like, I think Ishiguro is doing all of this intentionally,
Right.
but doesn't, make for the most engaging reading experience for me personally.
Sure. So let me pause there and just read what I have for the summary in here real
Mhm.
quick. And then we can go forward from there.
Yeah.
So, Christopher Banks, an English boy born in early 20th century Shanghai, is orphaned at age 9 when his mother and father both vanish under suspicious circumstances. Sent to live in England, he grows up to become a renowned detective and more than 20 years later returns to Shanghai where the Sino-Japanese War is raging to solve the mystery of the disappearances. The story is straightforward, its telling is remarkable. Christopher's voice is controlled, detailed, and detached. Its precision unsurprising in someone who has devoted his life to the examination of details and the rigors of objective thought. But within the layers of his narrative is slowly revealed what he can't or won't see, that his memory, despite what he wants to believe, is not unaffected by his childhood tragedies, that his powers of perception, the heralded clarity of his vision, can be blinding as well as enlightening, and that the simplest desires, a child's for his parents, a man's for understanding, may give rise to the most complicated truth.
Yeah. Is that like from the
Dust Jacket.
the dust jacket? Yeah. See, and that's the thing. There's a lot of things I feel like that dust jacket promises that I don't necessarily agree with is what we actually got. But again, maybe you are so right. Maybe once you read Never Let Me Go, there's just the world of possibilities starts getting going too far.
It shrinks. It's like it's hard when you start with somebody's masterpiece first and then you read everything else afterwards. You were talking earlier about having books that sit on your shelf for a long time because you're scared to read them. And that's usually what happens to me is I'll find an author and somehow I've stumbled upon their like considered their best work first.
Mhm.
And then I'm like, is everything else going to suck compared to this? Or like, am I in for a treat and everything else is going to be excellent? And I think it kind of sometimes depends. Like in this case, When We Were Orphans was written before Never Let Me Go. So this was like him cutting his teeth and learning to be the literary master that he is still.
Yeah.
And so, his style obviously has matured and developed since this particular book. But yeah, it can be sometimes a frustrating thing, like working backwards from the best book to the not best book.
Yeah. And I mean, like, I don't necessarily want to get it, twisted. Like, I don't think this is a bad book. It's just maybe it wasn't this what I was expecting, especially like it's supposed to be a detective novel. It is, it isn't that. But and the thing is, like, I don't really mind when books are not what I expect them to be, or like what there's, especially on the dust jackets, because we know that those don't always
Right.
tell the whole truth. So I'm not necessarily upset about that aspect, but more just like I do think this is a very expertly written book. Like the writing, the precision, as the book jacket called it, the intricate nature of the book and the story is very impressive. But it just does not have that emotional
Connection.
punch that I need. Like I just felt this entire time, like I was like, I get why we're doing this. I get why we're going down the memory rabbit hole and that we're kind of like examining things from his past. And here I am trying to examine these memories in the way that the book jacket suggests that I should be, of like, what's really going on here.
Mhm.
But then it's like, well, I don't know. When I got to the end, I'm like, nothing's really going on. It's exactly what they said it was. So
Yep.
yeah, it's well written, but just emotionally, I just did not feel much from it.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that I feel like you could never critique with Ishiguro is his prose. He's,
Oh yeah.
got a very beautiful writing style, even in books that are not as interesting as other ones. His writing style is always very smooth and flawless.
Mhm.
He's certainly mastered that part of the craft. I think in this case, like I said, this was kind of almost, I don't know, I don't want to call it experimental story structure because it's not really experimental necessarily, but it's like he was experimenting.
Yeah. Yeah.
playing with a different way of telling a story. Like you said, it's supposed to be a detective novel, but he like kind of leaned away from most of the things that you would look for in a detective novel, which I think is probably intentional. He's trying to like not do the same old, same old.
Yeah. 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 I get it. And you know what? I think like I can see a lot of the bones of what becomes Never Let Me Go in here, which is kind of weird. But like I love that. What I love doing is, finding an author that I love and then going back and reading their previous works. And it's like you can see the seeds of what becomes that masterpiece. And I really feel that here with the traveling through time and the re-examining of childhood through an adult's perspective, and that trauma that is informed in childhood and it follows you to adulthood. Like it's all there. It's just Never Let Me Go does it better.
Right. And that's what I mean about that, like going backwards in time, because you saw the rough draft and then you saw the finished product.
Yeah.
Basically. That's the way that it reads. It's like a debut author, sometimes you read a debut novel and you're like, this one's good-ish, but I know this person's going to be better 2 or 3 books down the road,
For sure.
I think that's kind of exactly what we're seeing here is like there's if you had never read Never Let Me Go, I don't think that this would be like, I don't think we would be reading it as harshly as we are now. It's because you've read the masterwork and then you have to go backwards,
Yeah, for sure. For sure.
But I mean, this did talk about a lot of really interesting subject matter. So it takes place in the Sino-Japanese War. It talks about the British basically. Oh, you disappeared there, Jamie.
Sorry, I was just trying to. Okay, I fixed the shadow issue. Sorry.
So this set during the Sino-Japanese War. This talks about Britain basically forcibly inundating China with opium and, becoming drug lords. It talks about, sex trafficking, murder, all sorts of different things. So, I mean, I do feel like this was packed with commentary on a lot of aspects of society and history, sometimes more successfully than others.
Mm-hmm.
I thought that one thing in particular was really interesting was how tone deaf our character remains to all of those things that are going on. And again, I think we touched on this already, but it's part of what I think made this book a little bit frustrating in places is that you have this essentially man-child who has refused to mature past, I don't know, wherever he's stuck, like in his early 20s. And he's not able to be objective and like look at the suffering around him, which kind of makes you, I don't know, it felt like it was like an allegory in some way for like, I don't know, groups of people or a country specifically, like, looking at the suffering around them and then just being like, oh, well, but what about our problems? So I thought that was kind of interesting.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, this character, and it's like, I don't want to, disstate what happens to his parents, well, specifically his mom, but we didn't, at the beginning of the book, we don't know what happens to either of them. But what happened, like his parents disappear and he is then taken back to England but he does have, he does become wealthy. He has money. He has a semi, relatively stable place. And then he starts up and coming into London society, high society.
Right.
And when he's there, he really does like look down on other people in London high society, specifically this woman that he meets, Sarah. He really looks down on her because she's like trying to climb that social ladder. Like she loves being in high society. She loves the opulence. She loves the wealth. She loves being a part of something. Right. And he really like acts like he's like, oh, well, that's not a noble pursuit. Like, intellect and solving problems is the noble pursuit. But meanwhile, he's only obsessed with being a detective and solving problems because he has his personal thing to solve. Now, I'm not trying to say that like the disappearance of your parents is not a very big thing in your life, but it does make him blind. It makes him he's almost kind of hypocritical because he doesn't, does he really value intellect for intellect's sake, or does he, is he simply trying to solve something he was never able to solve as a child? I don't know.
Yeah. I don't think that he really values intellect. I think that he is kind of singularly focused on this mystery and like this resolution of this trauma in his life. And again, like, losing your parents like this at a young age. I think he was 9 in the book when his parents disappear. That's very traumatic. Getting sent from, he's being raised in China, and then he gets sent to England, a whole different culture, new people raising him, no closure on what happened to his family. Like, yeah, all of that is very traumatic. It's like clear that he's like stagnated in that place. And the only thing driving him is closure. And it's like, I don't know. I just wanted to be like, dude, get a therapist. Like, like,
Yeah.
it's just,
Yeah.
and nobody like gives him that wake up call really throughout the book. Like, nobody shakes him and is like, dude, you're acting like an insane person. Or maybe people are, and we're just not seeing it because we're seeing it through his eyes. And his mind is completely rational and sane. I keep reverting back to that point where he's trying to find the house where he believes his parents are being held. We're going to get into spoilers here. I mean, hopefully if you're here, you've read this book. But just so you know, it's impossible to discuss without spoilers. But so he gets to this place where he thinks that his parents are being held, right? And he tries to get a taxi driver to take him there. And the taxi driver's like, no, too dangerous, too dangerous. And he completely ignores that. He blows it off. He's like, oh, whatever, just drop me off at a police station. Mm-hmm. And, he should take it seriously when the guy's like, violence is too close, like they're in a war zone. And this guy is telling him, you can't go over there. It's too dangerous. And he's like, oh, basically like makes it seem like this guy's just a coward. And then he goes into the police station and he's like, I need 7 or 8 men to take me to this household. Yeah. And he's walking past people that have been mangled by war, that are injured, that are lying there, too physically incapacitated to continue doing their job. And he is demanding that 7 or 8 of them accompany him on this fool's errand. And then, the police commander that's like, hey, dude, like we barely have enough men to do what we need to do, let alone go on your harebrained, chase here. Like, you can't go over there anyway. And he takes him up to see this, like the Warren and all of these tunnels and these little neighborhoods, and explains to him why it's just not feasible for them to march in there and like go try to find his parents. And he's just can't be dissuaded from this vision of like, my mom and dad are trapped in one of these dens here. It's just, for me, it just removed any sympathy that I had felt for him up until that point. Like you feel sympathetic for the little boy that went through the trauma. And then you get to this man that's just so like uncaring. And then, he's trying to save the Japanese soldier, and he's arguing with these Chinese people who are like basically being treated horribly by Japanese soldiers, who are having their homes invaded, who are victims of violence and things like that. And he's trying to explain to them why this one guy is a good man and how he'll shoot them if they try to attack. It was so infuriating. That whole part of that story for me, I was like, how is nobody like grabbing this man by the shoulders and shaking him and being like, wake up, snap out of this,
Yeah, I mean, there's so much that like I think about in that, and actually like through so much of the second half of this book, I really kind of thought that the conclusion that this book would come to is like, I didn't think he would find any of his family at all. I didn't think that, I thought the conclusion of this book was that what happened, it is him trying to find closure, but that doesn't necessarily mean in this like physical way. And I thought that this kind of would come to a head as he's, realizing in these moments that, I mean, obviously it's obvious that he was never going to find his parents here.
Yeah, he wasn't going to get a happy ending.
Yeah, he wasn't going to get a happy ending here. So I thought that would be sort of the conclusion that Ishiguro came to with this. I did think that it was going to come to the conclusion of what happened to his parents was part of a much larger societal, this big company, like this, multinational war, like not there, sometimes when, I think like what I found interesting about him being a detective and he's solving these murder cases, well, yeah, there's one person responsible for the murders and he can use some clues and track them down. Whereas I thought the conclusion that would come to here is this is way bigger than he can ever solve, and not even solve is even like maybe not the right word, but like this is way bigger than even one person could take down. This is bigger than one conclusion that you could come to. This is a very like multi-pronged societal, like embedded in the existence of a culture issue then that's not really what happens. But I thought that's where we were going with those scenes because it was so chaotic.
I agree. And I kind of would have liked it better that way. I think if it had been like a commentary on like, look, not everything is black and white. Not everything is like, get your detective lens and go solve the clues, I wish that there had been a little bit more gray area. And I felt like that was part of the letdown of the ending is that we get a very concrete ending. And then I think the thing that kind of disappointed me in the ending in particular is that I feel like it's kind of like the cliche, it's not bad enough that your mom would be dead. No, let's make sure that she's like sex trafficked and abused to the point that she's insane and living in a monastery somewhere. Like I hate that trope so much. I guess probably again at the time that this was written, that probably wasn't as common, but I've seen that done several times over now. It's just one of those things that I feel like it's like a careless way to end the story because it doesn't focus on the trauma that this woman went through and like the horrors she went through. It focuses on how traumatizing it is for the son that the mom went through that, and it just, I don't know, it feels kind of tone deaf maybe.
Exactly. And I mean, even like going back to kind of like what we were alluding to before, yeah, it's not focusing on her trauma at all. It's focusing on his trauma, how he's traumatized by this, removed experience. And meanwhile, like he was living in luxury in London. Like he was living it up. He's a celebrity. He's, successful. So, and again, like it's like, it's not to say that there was no trauma in things that he experienced. And it's not to say that, wealth or class is going to mean that you're never going to have any issues or that you don't feel trauma. That's not what I'm saying. But yeah, definitely becomes very apparent at the end or in the second half of this book when all of these people have suffered to such greater degrees. And he's just completely like oblivious to it.
Right. And I think he kind of stays oblivious to it too, if it makes sense. Like I never feel like there's any reckoning. Like it would be one thing if like, oh, he met his mom and found out what happened to her. And he's like, oh man, I've been so self-centered, all these people that I've put in danger. And there's like some kind of reckoning with this naivete or self-centeredness, but he doesn't really change or grow. He kind of just stays stagnated in that place. Even after he gets his resolution, I don't feel like there was a lot of growth for his character. And I think that kind of also affected how I felt about the book in the end.
But actually, now that you're saying this, and this is something that's just coming to me right now, and which is why I do love to have discussions about books, even though I didn't particularly love it, but something that's kind of making me realize when you say that is almost juxtaposed with the two other orphaned characters in the book, which Sarah, the woman I talked about earlier, she was orphaned as well. And then also, out of nowhere, he also adopts an orphan girl, and Jennifer is her name, and she's kind of she's the juxtaposition there because he's constantly commenting on how she's had it really rough. She's being moved around. She just gets adopted by this man she doesn't know, and she's kind of just okay with it. She kind of moves on when she's. There's this whole moment where she's like upset, or he thinks that she's going to be upset because her trunk of belongings, the only things she possessed in the entire world, was like lost. And he thinks that she's going to be just completely distraught over this. And when he tells her, oh, they couldn't save it, she's like, yeah, well, it's just stuff, I'll move on. So I guess that is she meant to be that juxtaposition of someone who has, dealt with a similar loss at a similar age, but who has, I don't know, just a different outlook on life, on a different, she's going to move forward. Same thing with Sarah. She is kind of a feisty character. She fights for what she wants. She pushes forward, and she doesn't let disappointments or, hurdles. She doesn't let them get in her way.
Right.
And I don't know if it's like a one-to-one, but yeah.
Yeah. I think like Sarah, if I'm remembering correctly, like at the end, she has a letter, right, that she had written, and there's like a little bit of reflection on like, oh, what could have been. But for the most part, she's like, yeah, my life turned out, good, and I'm happy with the direction it went. And she went through like even more horrible stuff. Like she was in internment camps and like, a bunch of really tragic stuff, and it's just really interesting comparing, like you mentioned, the other orphans in this story to our main character and like how everybody handles what they've been through.
Yeah. I mean, again, like I have to assume that Ishiguro is doing all of this intentionally because
Right.
I do trust his ability and his finesse as an author. Like, I really don't think that there's anything that he does that isn't, pretty well crafted, pretty
Right.
well thought out. But I think it is always interesting to like, I can acknowledge that I do think that those things are done intentionally, and I, do think that maybe he was intentionally writing a character that is frustrating to deal with.
Right.
That doesn't change my ultimate enjoyment of the book, and the reason why I, even in the first half, when we're not dealing with as much atrocity as happens in the second half, but in the first half it's just like it feels really aimless, and it feels like we are in this man's head trying to understand what he's so like of I don't even can't even think of what the words I want to say. Like we're trying to figure out what he's so corrupted over, but the whole time we're just kind of like, I mean, I don't know. Sounds bad, but we've heard worse. I don't know.
Yeah.
Emotional connection, I think.
Yeah. Again, I think too, like there are elements of this book that just it has to just do the time period. I think literature in like maybe the last 10 years has really like pushed the envelope in terms of shocking and in terms of violent, and not to say that like everyone's just gratuitously throwing that stuff out there, but I definitely think there have been a lot more books that have explored pretty extreme violence and like the horrors of war and sex trafficking and all these like horrible topics. And so maybe this book suffers because it was written 25 years ago in an era where I feel like this wasn't as common or maybe not as talked about. And so I think it might, again, just lose some of the edginess that it might have originally had due to, time.
Yeah. And also, speaking of like where literature has gone, I mean, in 25 years, there's been a massive change in the conversation of women characters and their roles in stories. And, how do we get to see women in stories? And
Right.
maybe it was true that at the time Ishiguro was writing this mother character who then went on to face serious abuse.
Right.
And maybe he wasn't writing that with the intention to juxtapose this male character. Like maybe he actually literally was just writing that as a source of pain for the male character. Like a lot has been discussed in that realm as well. So yeah, we can't really know. We don't really know, just two people here, but
it'd be really interesting to get to ask him someday. I'd be like, hey, is this mother suffering just a plot device, or were you trying to say something that I missed? Like,
right. Yeah.
I think the other thing that was kind of interesting too was the way that it's revealed to Christopher, like what happened to his family. It's his family friend who's like an uncle figure to him, and he like divulges all of this, like, hey, your father ran off and he died, but your mother, she's might be alive somewhere, and I sold her off and I did all these horrible things. And then like Christopher's not angry or doesn't like express outward anger, and so he's like, I'm going to tell you all the nitty gritty and like make you angry. It's like this whole unburdening himself, trying to like deal with the that he felt over this whole time period. And it's, again, like I'm reading it going, man, it must, I mean, I don't know exactly what I want to say. Like, it's like a frustrating plot device that this female suffering is used, to bring emotions to one character, like as a plot device for another character. It felt like, that could have been explored in so many better ways, and made so much more meaningful.
Yeah, and that character really doesn't. I mean, as far as the consequences that character goes through, it's really not a lot. I mean, he does have a breakdown, and he does like tell Christopher that he would be okay with Christopher killing him, as repent for that. But Christopher doesn't do it, and like just in general, it's just not. There's not a lot of consequences for that character. He got to not suffer in the end, even though he was at the hands of many other people suffering. So once again, I mean, part of the story, or just a product of what writing was doing at the time. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, even the thing is, like, even if Christopher had killed him too, like, so he'd have gotten shot and he'd have died relatively quickly. Like, it's like the comparative suffering there is minimal, and it doesn't take away like what this woman went through at all.
Yeah.
And I don't know, it just, to me, like, if this had been written in current times, I'd have felt like that was extremely lazy writing.
Yeah. And also, well, the thing I was thinking, I hadn't even thought so much about Philip in that moment, but what I was thinking about was, so at the halfway mark, I thought that I felt like this was pretty obvious. Like the company was involved in his parents' disappearance. I thought it was like an assassination because the mom was speaking out against the opioids, which is kind of sort of what happened, but in a roundabout way. But I thought that the company was going to go after his dad because of his mom, but more of just really not because of his dad specifically. And so I thought that was like where this was going to go. But then it just turned out that his dad actually just ran away to be with another woman. And I was like, what? I'm like, that's way worse than what I thought.
Yep.
And again, it's so hard for me to tell if that was like was Ishiguro leading us down the path to believe that his father's death was some sort of like, I mean, at the very least, you could have said that like he kind of, not that he was a martyr because he didn't do anything specifically, but like that his death was
righteous somehow.
Yeah, like what am I trying to say? Like a consequence of somebody else's actions, kind of like, he had to die, like stray bullet type of thing. But it wasn't even. But like no, like so is Ishiguro leading me down the path of thinking that that's how that was going to be, or is this a case where my brain was filling in blanks that was not there? I don't know.
Yeah. It's interesting. I mean, it's definitely a lot to discuss with this book. There's a lot of interesting, like, is it perception or is he doing this? Yeah, it is really interesting how basically only the female characters have anything of serious consequence happen to them. And then most of the male characters, walk by unscathed.
Yeah.
Or not unscathed, but like, I guess unscathed is not the right word. Losing your parents as a child does not leave you unscathed. But I don't know. I don't know how I want to express it. It just feels like the women dealt with all the shit. Sarah gets sent to a concentration camp. Mom gets sex trafficked and like has a mental collapse. Like, the men, meanwhile, like they live in their fantasy world, or they, build up these delusions of grandeur or whatever. And yeah, maybe that reality gets shattered, but like they don't deal with the horrors in the same way.
Yeah, and they were complicit. I mean, I'm not necessarily Christopher, but thinking about like Philip and thinking about the father, like they were both complicit in many horrible actions. So, and they got to literally run away from all of the consequences.
Yeah.
So, yeah, definitely a good point there. Whereas the women were now his mom like was very active against what was a horrible situation. So she was doing the righteous thing, but she wasn't necessarily passive, but like, yeah, it feels like unbalanced as far as the consequences of actions here.
Agreed. Let's see. So I had a couple questions in case we needed stuff to discuss. So when Christopher finds his mother in Hong Kong and she fails to recognize him, he asks her if she can forgive her son for not finding her. Why do you think he feels that he has never found her, even though he has? What else might he think he needs to ask forgiveness for? So how did you feel about that resolution, like when he finally gets to see her?
Yeah, I mean, I think at that point I was just like confused. I was like, what is the message here? What am I supposed to be getting out of this resolution? And also I kind of even had a weird moment where I was like, is this even his mother? Like, is this not like, is this even like, how do we even know? No. Like, yeah, how do we even know this is the person that this is the right person? Like, we would just never know. We would never have a way to know that. Right. So I haven't even had that moment where I was like, is she saying she doesn't recognize him because she she literally doesn't, or does she has she repressed memories of having a son, or like what is going on here? So to be honest, I was like just not entirely sure what I was supposed to be. Again, a situation of like with Ishiguro's writing, I don't know what's real, what's not, what's like you have this very like this you're just unsure of what reality is in, and this is not the first time with Ishiguro. This happens across his works, I would say.
I think I felt that way until he was like asked her about Puffin specifically, because I feel like
He did.
Yeah, once that happens, it's like I think the insinuation is that like that's how he's verified it's actually her. Yeah.
I mean that is fair. That is fair.
Because I mean, otherwise, like, what would the odds be that she nicknamed her child Puffin?
Yeah. I mean, I thought like I guess like what I took from that is like this is what I mean. It's like I wasn't totally on one side or the other. It was just a matter of like, well, he kind of like is leading this conversation, and here's this like crazy impassioned man, and like I don't know, maybe that's just the entire time I was just like, what is this reality? Like, what are we actually looking at here?
Yep. Yeah, I think that in terms of like him feeling like he didn't find her, I think it's just a regret that he didn't find her sooner. Obviously he found her eventually because he's there talking to her, but I think it's a regret of, not knowing what happened to her earlier. He waited 20 years to come find her. And like, if he had found her maybe in his, 10 years earlier, maybe she would have still had her sanity, or, who knows? So I think that that's like really it when he's talking about like, if he didn't find her. And, I think that that's probably also what he thinks he might need to ask forgiveness for not like trying harder sooner, I guess. Feeling some guilt of like having left her to suffer like long-term, to the point of mental collapse.
And is it ever really like specified as to, and that this could have just been me like actually genuinely missing something, but is it ever specified as to like why he had to wait until a certain time to look for them?
Not that I'm aware of.
Because I didn't really get that either, because like he kept saying like when he was deciding to go to Shanghai, he was like, oh, and this is the moment that I'm finally going to do something. But it's like, well, I don't really see what was stopping you before if you felt like, well, you needed to go to Shanghai to look.
Right.
But I don't know why he didn't go sooner. I really honestly don't know.
Well, if he didn't go sooner, then it wouldn't have been convenient for the ending, because, mom would have only suffered for a handful of years, and maybe
only 10 years instead of 20.
And then we'd have to explore a complex female character, and that's hard.
Right. Obviously that is, I mean, just has to sit there for 10 more years before he can, I don't know.
Maybe, I mean, I don't want to say that that's the case with Ishiguro. I mean, I've seen that, he's written complex female characters in other books and stuff like that. It's just, that's kind of how that, feels, it's just.
I definitely thought that and that was not, I thought there was going to be a reason. I thought he was going to give us the like, oh, I'm going to Shanghai now because I got this. I mean, obviously I would think if you're looking for your parents, the first place I would probably go is Shanghai, but that's just me.
Well, especially because he seems so obsessed about this. Like, he's like pretty fixated to the point of like not being aware of the reality surrounding him. So like, how did he remain in this fixated state for 20 years and then become a successful detective and, make his life, relatively okay. And then, but he's like so focused that, he doesn't notice anything going on around him. I don't know. It's just, there's a lot of things that don't make sense. But I mean, I think that's kind of also, again, due to he's an unreliable narrator. He's supposed to be unreliable. We're supposed to question what's reality and what's, his own kind of semi-delusional state. So. Yeah, this was an interesting one. I definitely feel like I got more out of it than the last two books. I thought there was more to discuss too, like more meat to it and everything. So an improvement, I guess.
I know. I'm like, this is why I'm like, I don't know if I feel like we've got to get it together in the new year and we need to pick some more winning books. Like there was a lot to talk about here, and I still am going to keep reading Ishiguro. I want to still read 2 of his previous books. if he ever comes out with another one, I'll definitely jump on it. But it's like, this has kind of made me realize that just because I loved one book by an author, it does not necessarily mean that they're always going to be perfect all the time.
I'm just looking at the back flap right now because I was just thinking about if he's going to write any more books. So he was born in 1954, so that would make him 71 this year.
Oh,
so
gosh.
Hopefully he's got a few more years of book writing.
Yeah, I hope he's got, I mean, yeah, I think it was like a big deal when Clara and the Sun like came out. Everyone's like, oh, and then new Ishiguro.
Yeah.
So I do hope he's got like one more. But now what this has made me realize is that like not necessarily everything that Ishiguro does is something that I love in a book. Like this was very, very slow. And I don't mind a reflective book, but man, this goes at a snail's pace. And so I don't know, but that's kind of like his thing. That is totally his thing. So I have to understand that about, picking up, future stuff from him or whatever, or previous stuff from him as well. So.
Right. Well, we both haven't read The Buried Giant, so let me know when you get there.
I think it's going to be a couple years. I think that's going to sit on my shelf for a little longer.
Fair. Yeah. So I guess that's a good place for us to segue into what's going on with the Backlist Book Club for 2025. Obviously, we're like in the final 2 days here of 2024, which is kind of crazy. And so you and I were discussing plans for the upcoming year. I think we kind of mentioned this in previous live streams, but we're going to do keep with the bi-monthly schedule, but we're just going to kind of be more rigid about that, right? Mm-hmm. So January, we'll post polls. We're going to get some books together tonight. So January 1st, I could put the poll up for voting. We'll run voting for a couple weeks. Mid-January, we'll announce what book won, and then that'll give everyone like 5 weeks to read. And then towards the end of February, we'll have a discussion, and we're going to work on being better about like posting stuff a little bit more in advance. Most of that's my fault. I've been a chaos monster for the last couple months.
No, it's not just your fault. It's everyone's busy. Everyone's struggling. It's not just you.
Yeah. But I've had like a ton of stuff in the last couple months. So we'll definitely work on being a little more consistent and a little bit more scheduled. And so just if you're interested in reading with us, in January 1st, look for that poll, vote for the book that calls your attention. We were discussing about possible themes for the January/February pick. So we'll see what we come up with. And if you're wondering how we pick the books for the polls too, just out of curiosity, basically, Jamie and I will each pull 3 or 4 books from our shelves that are published over 5 years ago. And then we like look at like, have I read one of them? We'll take that off the list. Has she read one of them? We'll take that off the list. And then we try to come to like 4 or 5 books to put up on a poll. We're looking forward to doing this in 2025, picking out hopefully some better books, at least ones that we enjoy more, because the last few, I think we both have kind of unanimously been like, this was okay to pour.
But our expectations were very high for all of them.
I know, that's the thing. Like, so, I mean, Tessa Moshfegh, I knew she was going to be kind of like a hit and miss just because I feel like she's a polarizing author. Yeah. So like, no surprises there, really. But Wolf Hall, I've heard universally so much love for that book. I expected it to be like a 4 to 5 star read for both of us. Both of us were kind of like, meh. The Hunger sounded amazing, like horror, historical fiction about, people freezing to death in the Sierra Nevadas and eating each other. Like, how does that?
Let's go.
Yeah. How does this not, the Donner Party? Like, how does this not sound like an amazing book? Yeah. And then it was so tedious and slow. And then this one, I love Ishiguro's writing. I would say that he is an author that's kind of an auto-buy for me. So I expected to enjoy this a little more than I did as well.
I think we're going to have to kick off the year with something a little faster paced, because the previous couple we've read have been long and slow. So we got to go the other way. I feel like,
The Hunger wasn't super long, but I feel like
it was like almost 500 pages. It was around 450, I think. It was pretty.
I guess just because we read it after Wolf Hall, and I felt like Wolf Hall was the hardest book of my life.
True.
But I feel like maybe we've got to pick like some books that are not like modern classics,
Right,
like we got to steer in a different direction from there.
Yeah.
But either way, we're going to come up with a list of books. So look for that and vote. And then, we'll announce mid-January what we're going to end up reading. Anything else you want to add in this?
No, happy New Year, everyone. I'm so excited to keep doing this. I always love our discussions.
I know it is fun, even like when we aren't enjoying the book, to like sit and discuss, what the author's trying to say and the writing style and all of that. It really forces me to, I think, be a more involved reader sometimes, because sometimes when a book isn't vibing with me, I tend to I read it, but I don't know if I take in as much. But knowing that I have to discuss it afterwards, I'm like, I gotta pay attention.
Yeah. And I'll always, even though I didn't love this book, I will always associate this book with a great discussion and in that, so it was a great experience nonetheless.
Yep. Sounds good. All right, guys. Well, we both have things to get to, so we're going to end this discussion here. We'll have that poll up in a couple days and look forward to talking more books with you guys in 2025. Have a safe and happy New Year's, everyone.